Hi, and this is the second video in the question and answer section, and this is to answer Linda's question. And she asked about the reasons. I think she asked specifically about loss of appetite, but I think loss of appetite is not necessarily the only problem or the only eating behaviour that we see present in frontotemporal dementia. In fact, for a lot of people, increase in appetite is common. So I've put together a quick slideshow to talk about this and metabolism in frontotemporal dementia. So we often focus on the cognitive and the behavioural symptoms when we talk about FTD. So for some it's memory loss, for others it's not. For some it's the language problems, the expressive and receptive communication challenges. For some it's the behavioural component, the executive function, personality changes. They're the things we hear about more often. But there are also physical sides to the neurodegenerative process. And that's what we're talking about when we explore the issue of appetite. So we see here that eating abnormalities are present in 6 out of 10 people with FTD. So 60%, that's a lot of people who will present with problems in their eating behaviours. And studies at Neura in Sydney, Australia, suggest that people with the behavioural variant of FTD have the increased appetite and abnormal eating behaviours, and we'll see this at the table manners, and also most notably an increased preference for sweet foods, and that's especially so when we compare this population to patients with Alzheimer's disease or healthy controls. And patients with the semantic dementia, so this is the language variant of FTD, also have similar abnormalities, but to a lesser extent. So we're seeing this presentation mostly in the behavioural variants, but also in other variants of FTD over and above other variants and other dementias. So both groups of FTD patients have increased carbohydrate and sugar intake, and as a result of this, an increased BMI or increased body weight. So we do see them preferring a natural preference for the carbs and the sweety kind of foods, and that's quite common. Despite these abnormalities, the two groups have similar ratings of hunger and satiety. So we're looking at whether they're eating because they're hungry and stopping because they're full, we're seeing that this is not dissimilar to other groups. So this is suggesting that the increased food intake is not just a simple response to increased appetite. So we can safely say they're not eating because they're hungry. Something else is happening. So if it's not hunger that's driving the abnormal eating behaviour, we need to sort of look at what else is linked to this behaviour, and particularly in the context of dementia. So we know peripheral insulin resistance in FTD patients has been noted, but that in itself is not necessarily very telling, because this could be because of the increased sweet and carb intake and the increased weight. So we know it exists, but we're not sure the cause of it. There is not a lot of information and not a lot of studies about how energy metabolism may affect the process of neurodegeneration, but there are a couple of studies, particularly in FTD specialists, so in neuro, that have been done and continue to be done. But certainly more research needs to happen looking at abnormal energy metabolism, because there are still some questions to be answered. And it is known that abnormal energy metabolisms, things like glucose regulation, can be detrimental in people with Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. We know this. However, and I find interesting that motor neuron disease, which is closely related to FTD, also have distinct abnormalities in cholesterol and other dietary fats, or the triglycerides. But the critical difference in motor neuron disease and the changes in metabolism and abnormal energy metabolism is that those abnormalities actually seem protective against the progression of the disease. So that's quite a interesting distinction. A study here, and I've referenced it up here, and I've referenced it again at the end of the slides if you want to look at the whole study, but it investigated the frequency of changes in eating behaviours and the sequence of development of eating behaviours in FTD and Alzheimer's. They had 3 groups of patients that they studied. There's the frontal variant dementias, so our typical FTDs, the semantic dementias, so the language variant, and the Alzheimer's presentation. And they looked at these 3 groups in the context of 5 specific domains. So they looked at these groups with swallowing problems, appetite changes, food preferences, eating habits, and other oral behaviours. And what they found, I'll put this in the red here, is that in semantic dementia, so in the language variants, the developmental pattern was very clear. A change in food preference developed initially. So at the beginning, the patient changed what they liked to eat. That was then followed by appetite increase and altered eating habits and other oral behaviours. And finally, as the disease progresses, there are swallowing problems. In the frontal variant FTD, the first symptom was altered eating habits and possibly appetite increase. So earlier on in the frontal variants, you're getting that increase for the sweet foods and the carb preferences. If you're interested in Alzheimer's disease, the pattern was not clear, although swallowing problems developed much more early than in the FTD. I'm just wondering if this is important. The conclusion is that the change in eating behaviour was significantly more common in both frontotemporal dementia groups. So we are seeing the eating problems mostly in FTD than in other types of dementia. And it is likely that the changes in the eating behaviour reflects the involvement of a common network in both FTDs that have to do with the ventral part of the frontal lobe, some of the temporal lobe, and the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional regulation. And I won't get into the neuroanatomy, but we can say that it is due to these parts of the brain not working properly in the FTDs. Now, Linda, I know that you asked more about loss of appetite, and I have focused a bit in this about increase in appetite, but those same brain regions that I just mentioned are also responsible for frequency of other altered eating behaviours. And you will see here in red, Linda, that 30% of people with FTD experience loss of appetite. So we're looking at altered eating behaviours more generally here. And if you're interested, you can look at that slide. And from the study, here's the reference down here, an estimate of the percentages of people with specific changes and what those changes are in their eating behaviour. An interesting one at the end there is 20% of people with semantic dementia eat non-food items. This is also called PICA, P-I-C-A, putting things in their mouth that are not really edible. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, and I will end this video there. Thank you.